So let's talk a little bit about visualization. Now, the particular question that I got, which I want to cover from here, is I struggle learning new exercises. And this is from a person who is kind of getting into strength training. I struggle learning new exercises, and I kind of find I spend a lot of the time just falling over myself, really struggling with balance and struggling to do the exercises. And I don't really end up doing a huge amount to actually push myself. I'm not really feeling like I'm getting a huge workout. Like, what can I do here? And this is a really, really, really common thing that a lot of people get, particularly in the early days of their training, whether it's the early days of their strength development, or whether you're just introducing some new exercises, a new type of training, whatever it may be. Very, very, very common thing. Now, the problem here, is some exercises realistically are pretty tricky to learn. Some exercises are pretty simple. We may have done it a million times. Some exercises can be tricky. Like, for example, I get pretty much every single one of my hikers and mountaineers doing some form of a step down in their training to one degree or another, and one variation. And that in itself, there's a lot of moving parts. You've got to make sure that you're not falling over. You've got to make sure your hips are getting pushed back. You've got to make sure your knees aren't knocking in. You've got to make sure you're loading up the right muscle. It can be a little bit tricky to learn. And quite often when we get into this, if we're, say, training in a gym environment and we've got people around us, sometimes we can look around and be like, oh my gosh, I'm having a really hard time here. I'm really, really struggling with things. Everyone else looks like they're perfect. Everyone else looks like they're nailing this. Like, why can't I be like that? Or maybe a case of sort of, doing online classes and you're like, well, I feel like no one else is complaining that they can't do this. Like, why am I struggling with it? Um, Realistically, when it comes down to training for hiking or just training in general, it's always a good idea just not to compare yourself to other people, because some people out there have been doing the same thing for years and years and years. And a lot of people who go into the gym, they may have been doing these exercises for 10 years already, and that may be why they're good at things. On top of that, when it comes down to actually learning movements, some people are quick learners and some people have this great body awareness and know exactly where they're at. And some people are just slower learners. They may not have great balance. They may not have great body awareness. They may not kind of know what's going on or whatever it may be. For myself, even though I am a personal trainer, even though I have been, training in one way or another my whole life, even though I've made a career of teaching people how to do things, I am a really, really, really slow learner when it comes to new movements. And if I actually try to do a new movement which I haven't done before, and if it's something that's a little bit complicated, it takes me ages to learn. And the stuff you see from me online is stuff that I've practiced a lot, but I'm a really slow learner myself, and I know there's a lot of people out there. Now, when it comes down to this situation, the tricky thing is if we are a bit of a slow learner, if we don't have great body awareness or whatever it may be, and we're finding these exercises, which is a bit of a struggle, there's two things that can be a little bit tricky. Number one, you may end up spending your entire workout just trying to figure these exercises out. You might spend the entire workout just trying to sort of stabilize yourself, and you're wobbling around and this and that. And you may end up finishing the workout and you're like, well, I didn't really do anything. I don't feel like I worked my muscles. I don't feel like this. And you're not actually pushing yourself to improve. And this can not only happen just in 1 week, but it may happen in 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever it may be. That can be, can be a legitimate situation. On top of that, it can get really frustrating. Like, if you're trying to figure out an exercise and you're wobbling all over the place, you just can't get it right no matter what you do, you can get really frustrated. We all do. And maybe you'll just abandon the workout. Maybe you'll just finish the workout not feeling good. And sometimes something that should be a positive thing in your day ends up being a negative thing. And I've had that before when I tried things, and literally all day I'm thinking about, oh my gosh, I sucked at that. Why couldn't I get that? And this and that. I've done that, and it's ruined days for me before. And it's so much fun. And if you're in this situation where you're following a training program, and most training programs will only ever have you doing an exercise once or maybe at most twice in a week. If you're only really doing this once or twice a week for 5 minutes or 10 minutes a week, this can take a long, long, long time to learn because you don't really get a huge amount of exposure to it. It can be a little bit tricky. Now, one way of going about this is, you can just practice these movements over and over and over, practice them at home, practice them through the day, and you can practice these, and that can often be great, and that's a definitely legitimate way of learning. But this isn't always super practical because some exercises will get you sweaty, some exercises require equipment, some exercises are just too frustrating, or whatever it may be. So we kind of want to think about how can we speed this process along in a way that's practical, in a way that's doable, and in a way that is going to be effective. So essentially coming down to the solution of this is one really, really, really good way of speeding this along and getting better at these exercises is using visualization. Now, this may sound a little bit hippy-dippy, but bear with me because it can be very, very, very useful. Essentially, visualization is literally what it sounds. It's thinking about what you're doing mental rehearsal of what you're doing in your head. So you're not physically actually doing this, but you are purely just thinking about it. Now, this may sound a little bit funny. This may sound a little bit simple, but I promise you, if you do this in the right way and if you do it consistently, it can be an incredibly powerful tool. Now, if you don't believe me, one of the professional athletes will use this all the time. They will use this before actions, that even if they practice something 1,000,001 times, they will use this just to reinforce it before they do it. You'll see footy kickers, and if you watch like the NRL or the rugby or anything, and they're like lining up to kick a ball, for a kick, and they line up, and you can kind of see they walk back, and they're sort of looking at the goal, looking at the ball, and this and that. A lot of them are actually doing this in their head. Even though they're professional athletes, they go through this because it's very, very powerful for them. On top of that, a really, really interesting side of things is visualization. There's been some interesting studies that have shown that purely using visualization can actually improve your strength to a degree. Now, that's interesting because a lot of strength strength development in a nutshell comes from two areas. We can either improve the size and the capacity of our muscles and actually improve our muscles to produce force. And the flip side of things, we can also improve what we call our neural connections, the connection between our brain and our muscles. They're two different ways of getting strong. Visualization, just purely thinking about exercise and thinking about things, can actually improve the connection between our brain and muscles. And there's been studies which have been showing people who have literally only done this for like 4 or 6 or 8 weeks or something, just thought about doing things, have actually gotten stronger, which is crazy. Like, it's not quite as strong as actually doing the thing, but it is very, very powerful. So essentially what you want to do here is, if you are going to be using this, is use the process. Basically, you want to sit down and you want to think about what exercise have you been struggling with, what are you trying to learn, and really just think through that exercise. Essentially what you want to do, it's not just like, hey, I'm thinking of that exercise, this and that, but we want to get as detailed as possible. We want to think about from top to bottom this entire movement. We want to mentally imagine you're going through it, going through, up and down, and really, really think in your head. Try to feel your balance and how that feels. Try to feel your working muscles and try to work through a whole set of exercises. So, for example, if you were doing this while you're watching, we might use a squat as an example. And you may just sit here, close your eyes right now, and just imagine you're standing up. Then imagine we start our squat movement and you're pushing your bum back, slowly pushing the bum back, bending the knees. As you're coming down, you can imagine that your quads are loading up. You can imagine that center of mass having to keep upright. Imagine how it feels in your ankles. Imagine what your knees are doing. Imagine what your torso is doing. Have a little pause at the bottom and feel the quads locking in. Squeeze the glutes, and then imagine pushing yourself up. Going through that is what this is all about, visualization. And if you can go through a whole set of this and really, really think about it, rep by rep by rep, doing this and working this through, it can be really, really powerful. So you can kind of use this in two different situations. Number one, you can kind of do this immediately before an exercise. So if you're starting an exercise and you're like, oh, I haven't done this in a little while, I'm kind of a little bit nervous about it, you can literally just give yourself a moment. Take a minute. Just look at the exercise and imagine this in your head. You don't have to close your eyes and look a bit funny in the gym, but just work through it. And then go through the exercise. And that might make all the difference. And on top of that, you can also just do this in odd moments in the day. You can get more exposure to this practice through the day and just give it a whirl. So if you're at work, you can do it in between meetings or in between phone calls and just do a set of this here and there. You can do it on public transport. If you're just sitting on the bus or on a train or on the subway, you can practice this. If you're literally just sitting on the couch in between, if you're in ad breaks or something, you can do this. It can be really, really useful just to filter this in through your week so you can speed along that movement. For myself, I use this when I was learning, when I was a bit younger, I was really, really went through a phase of just trying to get really, really, really strong. And one of the exercises I was trying to get really, really strong at was the deadlift. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to push some huge amount of weight. But I often found that, my deadlift, I struggled with it a little bit, trying to improve things and make it better. I did struggle a little bit. So what I did was I actually went through this visualization. I kind of got, in all honesty, I got a little bit obsessive about it, but I started thinking about it all the time. I thought about when I was on the bus into work. I thought about it when I was eating my lunch. I thought about this. I thought about how my muscles worked and how I went through it. And I tell you right now, it can be really, really powerful. I can literally sit here and think about that deadlift and feel those muscles right now because I practice it and developed it, and it really does pay off when you're actually doing the movements. So if you do struggle with certain exercises and you're like, hey, there's a bit of slow progress, I'm not really seeing the movement forward for this or whatever it may be, visualization can be really, really useful. And it's not just reserved to gym exercises. You can do this with your hiking. You can do this with like climbing. You can do this with like mountaineering specific techniques or whatever it may be. You can apply this in many, many, many different situations. So hopefully that gives you some ideas around how to bump forward these new exercises. It may sound a little bit funny, but it can be really, really, really powerful.